everyone. Welcome to VLGA Connect. It's time for the weekly governance update brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers and featuring the pontifications of the VLGA Chief of Staff, Stephen Cooper. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Chris, and only possible because of your incisive questioning. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. What sort of a week have you had?
I've had a great week, Chris. I think people are getting towards the end of the year and there's a bit of weariness around, but no, it's good to be out and about.
Can we start perhaps with the 16 days project, which has just kicked off, and I'm seeing a lot of activity on social media, etc., from all around local government and beyond. The VLGA has had its own walk against family violence this week.
We did, Chris, day one of the 16 days of activism, and there was never a doubt that we should do something about it, that the statistics around family violence are just horrendous. So, yeah, we all donned our orange and put our orange bandanas on our pets and went for a walk sort of separately, but Deborah put together a lovely poster, which was terrific, and which I've only got one complaint about.
And what's that complaint? Can we air that here publicly?
Look, I don't know. It might sort of symbol a bit of discord at the VLGA, but Catherine, of course, made a powerful and very appropriate statement in her role as CEO, which we all get behind. But we didn't, well, it might have been me or my dog, Boof. Catherine's dog, Louis, just looked absolutely angelic. And when I showed that photo to Boof, he just turned up his nose and walked away. And it was, it was a look that said, "I don't chew home furnishings."
I side with Wolf. All right, so well done to the VLGA team and, of course, the council teams all across the state and indeed the country who are getting behind that very important program.
I think the power, Chris, has been how many councils and other organisations have got behind this and spoken out very publicly. And we've got to talk about this issue. And, you know, for you and I as men, you have to, you know, we have to talk about it and own it. It's really important.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Now, probably the biggest local government story to come out in Victoria, at least this week, is this suggestion that the city of Moreland may have a name change in its future. I think it's a bit early to say it's definitely going to happen, though, Steve, and we'll talk about what the process looks like if we can work it out. But this has just come to light this week.
Yeah, interesting though, although I did see a photo, Chris, that there was an awareness that there's a historical marker on a Moreland Road sign which points to the fact that Farquhar McRae had a property called Moreland named after a similarly named property in Jamaica where there were slaves run. So it was sort of known, but it's come to the attention of the council this week and caused quite a bit of interest both internally and I know I heard some talk back as well on whether the council should change the name.
So, as I understand it, some traditional owners, representatives have approached the council to say, are you aware of this background? Perhaps it's time to put this on the agenda that a more appropriate name could be sourced.
Absolutely, Chris. And look, we've talked about this before about in terms of culture, we've talked about historic markers around names, around statues, I guess around curating that sort of thing and about, you know, the importance of it as an issue. And the council will be wrestling with, you know, how to navigate that in a way where it does no harm. And, you know, and in some ways people line up in their kind of political tribes on this too, I suppose, because there's also been some commentary around, well, what will it cost? I'd also suggest there's an element of, well, what would it cost if we don't? You know, it is quite a powerful statement if the council is able to achieve that change, which presumably would involve some pretty extensive engagement with the minister.
So the minister was quoted in the story in The Age about this as saying it's an issue that needs to be worked on by the council and the local community, including the traditional owners. Strong collaboration with traditional owner groups is vital as we progress our nation-leading path to treaty, truth and justice. And it's true, Victoria certainly is leading the way in terms of a treaty and truth-telling process. I guess the thing that crossed my mind is this just the tip of the iceberg? What other issues are out there in terms of naming of, well, let's just stick with naming of councils that might carry some sort of history that we don't want to continue to celebrate or recognise?
Chris, I think you have to take this one council name at a time, and it's a pretty good response by the minister to kind of put it back in the court of the council and say, can you do this and run a process in a way, and I think the subliminal message is, where you do no harm, because there's no point doing this, or it becomes really difficult to just do this if all it is a divisive issue that does nothing to advance understanding. Moreland Council pretty good at doing consultation and engagement with its communities. It's one of those councils you would look to, and its own community would expect it to do it well. So, they'll be thinking through what sort of process should we run through, in terms of, weighing up the costs and benefits associated with the name change. But it's equally in an environment where Victoria is going through treaty and truth-telling discussions. This is another very important topic.
So what do you understand the process to be? Clearly, the minister seems to be saying the council needs to do the groundwork, get the community on side, do the consultation, etc. What happens then? Correct me if I'm wrong, the council doesn't have the power to change its own name.
I don't believe it does, Chris. And I had a quick look, and in fact, what I'm about to say is not correct. I'm pretty sure that Tony Rownick from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers will be on the phone to me fairly quickly to correct me. But I don't believe there's anything in the Local Government Act that says you can change the name, that the name-changing power comes from the Constitution Act, which is where there is the power for the state to legislate around the constitution of a council, which would be, the area and the name, presumably. So the name of the council comes from the Constitution Act, and I presume there's some pathway there by which the name would be changed. So it's outside the sort of geographical place names regime that we would have for, streets and parks and so on.
So ultimately, it will land in the court of the state government, and we'll see what happens from there. Got a sense of how long this process might take?
Months or years, I think, Chris.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah. All right, we'll watch that one with interest. I suspect that won't be the last time we talk about it here on the Governance Update. So let's move on. There's a bit of news around CEOs this week. Let's touch on Yarra firstly, and we will come back to talk more about Yarra on another matter a little later. But as we've talked about before, Steve, the CEO of Yarra, Vijay Vaidyanathan, has resigned and is leaving to take up the post as CEO of the new body called Homes Melbourne, which is part of the City of Melbourne. That happens early in the new year. So, of course, they're going to be in need of a CEO. And this week they've announced that their Director of Works and Assets, Chris Levers, will be the acting CEO from December 17, which I think is a great appointment.
Experienced executive Chris Levers, LG Pro board member. Yep. So safe hands for Yarra for the next little while they go through the recruitment process.
I had the pleasure of working with Chris for a little while I was interim CEO at LG Pro, and I think he'll make a great CEO, at least a great acting CEO at this point, and then who knows beyond that. So well done to Chris. The second biggest council in Australia, Steve, which is?
Gold Coast.
Correct. After?
Brisbane.
Correct. Well done. You're shooting on all... barrels today. Gold Coast CEO has finally been appointed. Now, this has been an interesting drama. Dale Dixon was the CEO there for like 18 years, finished up early this year and was replaced by a gentleman whose name's escaping me right now, who resigned after 3 weeks in the role. So it's been filled by an acting since March, I think. And finally this week, the announcement has come that a top bureaucrat from the state of Tasmania is making the move to the Sunshine State.
Interesting one, Chris. And we sort of forget in Victoria of the breadth of responsibility of those local councils in Queensland. I know that some years ago it was always reported that the Brisbane City Council had a bigger turnover than the whole state of Tasmania, and I would suspect that Gold Coast is not far behind. So for a top bureaucrat from Tasmania, they're going over to an organisation that, in terms of the service offerings and complexity, is pretty much the equivalent of a state government. So, yeah, an interesting appointment.
So his name is Tim Baker. He's currently the Secretary of the Department of Primary Industries, Parks, Water and Environment in Tasmania. But interestingly also, he's the former Chief of Staff for former Premier Will Hodgman of Tasmania. So some terrific credentials there. Of course, we all know running a council is a slightly different kettle of fish, but we wish him best of luck. And I see the media is already starting to roll out stories about the big hot topics that he's going to need to be managing on his arrival.
Oh, look, the development pressures, the environmental pressures, just the political dynamic at Gold Coast. I think it's extraordinary that Dale, former RMIT local government graduate, Dale Dixon, I should say, was able to manage that for so many years.
Before we leave Queensland, Steve, just want to touch on another Queensland story. What's happening at North Burnett Regional Council is really interesting. The mayor there is stepping down.
Actually, Chris, I don't want to be too critical, but we would not normally sort of get into the detail of a mayor stepping down. That's, interesting, but keep going.
Well, for personal reasons, apparently. But hard on the heels of that, the CEO is now stepping down. The mayor is Rachel Chambers. The CEO is Rachel Cooper. I was getting confused with my Rachels in my own head. They're both stepping down this coming next month, December. The media is suggesting it might have something to do with looming vaccine mandates, and they're both refusing to make any comment on that. So I'm not going to, but
no.
I think it's a very interesting state of affairs that's playing out there in North Burnett. Watch this space.
I think watch this space, and you'd have to imagine, I mean, this whole vaccine mandate issue is a live one, but it would seem that the state premiers, who do have the responsibility for health, are pretty dogmatic on the topic. Although, there's been some comments about, well, what do we do when we get to a high vax rate? Maybe they won't be the last ones.
Which, to some extent, they're just getting to dealing with issues that we've been dealing with in previous months. And I noticed some of our councils in Victoria are getting some media attention because of some councillors that may or may not be vaccinated, and we've still got some hybrid meeting arrangements happening.
Yeah, we do. There was a piece in The Age today that reported on Melton Council, and people might like to go and read that. Yeah.
I'll just say it's not the only council that's being challenged by those issues, and that's probably all we should say on the matter right now. I want to go to Tasmania now. We're getting all over the place, or certainly down the eastern seaboard today. Steve, there's an interesting case out of Derwent Valley in Tasmania, where a councillor a couple of years back now, February 2019, wanted to open a business, a pizza shop, didn't have the necessary approvals in place from the council, opened the business anyway, was issued with an infringement notice by the council. And the director of local government in that state has conducted an investigation and found that the councillor brought the council into disrepute by operating his business unlawfully. Under the improvement direction, this councillor, Councillor Paul Belcher, is required to undertake ethics training and apply for an occupancy permit. Failure to comply could mean a 6-month suspension from council. This is not something you see a lot, is it? A councillor's business role conflicting with their governance role as a member of the governing body of that council.
It's a governance can of worms, Chris. I just wonder, I guess the thing that strikes me is that the Integrity Agency has taken the view, obviously, that as a councillor having taken an oath of office has a high standard of conduct to maintain. And, it's not unusual for someone in the community to, disregard a health order, and that process, normally would take its course. There's an added complexity for a councillor, as you've touched on, because of the conflict of interest. There's also a risk of the councillor misusing their position to achieve an advantage, of being perceived to give an instruction to council officers. I'm not saying that that's happened in this case, but it would be a risk in any conversation that occurs. And clearly the Integrity Agencies wanted to make a strong stand.
And there's been some commentary around that framework, that process for dealing with such matters, which I think there'll be some further discussion about. Some people are saying that the process needs to be reviewed. and overhauled, and it doesn't take into account that, and I quote the Local Government Association of Tasmania CEO Dion Lester is saying, it must be remembered that councillors and community members are human beings who, no matter how much they try, will make occasional mistakes, and the framework should be reserved, in his view, for matters of a more serious nature.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Chris, and we won't have to talk about it for another, 3 years, I suppose, 2.5 years, until the next round of elections. But I think there's often an absence of awareness from first-time candidates that getting on council won't necessarily enable you. In fact, might make dealing with your personal matters with the council far more complex because of the creation of those conflicts of interest. But it does go to trust and does go to the public view of the council.
Absolutely. And I should point out, in this case, the council has been on the council for 7 years. So that's another point that was made, not a brand new councillor running afoul of things that they, probably should have been aware of.
No, that's true. Now, there is a bit going on in Tasmania, though, Chris, as we know this.
Now, I thought you'd be looking for a way to introduce cricket back into the discussion. I think it's warranted, though, given the events of the since we last spoke, in terms of conduct.
Chris, well, some would say the most important office in the land ahead of the Prime Minister. I'm not sure. In fact, you may be surprised what I'm about to say. I'm not sure I share that view. I think we get a bit carried away with the role of the captain of the Australian cricket team. But
couldn't agree with you more.
But of course, since there is, I think, just an incredibly interesting series of conduct issues associated with the behaviour of now former Australian captain Tim Payne.
So what do you take away from this? It's salacious, it's been making headlines, etc., but obviously there's more going on in the background here about process, about fairness. What do you take away from it, Steve?
Few issues, Chris. So for those that don't know, and most will, Tim Payne was involved in a flirty text exchange with a staff member at Cricket Tasmania who subsequently complained about that exchange. Now, people flirting, relationships established at work is not necessarily a problem, although it can be in terms of issues of power, subsequent bullying accusations when it all goes bad, conflicts of interest when not declared. So those are potential issues, but there was nothing to say that this particular exchange was problematic, except that Mr. Payne decided to post an explicit photo of himself to the other person, which was also subject of a complaint to Cricket Tasmania. Cricket Tasmania said that there was nothing to answer, and I would just make the point that the Telecommunications Act has an offence in relation to using a telecommunications carrier to convey material that is likely to offend. And I would have presumed that's likely to offend, and it would call into question a finding by Cricket Tasmania that the Code of Conduct didn't cover it. If that's the case, they probably need to go and have a look at their Code of Conduct.
What I couldn't quite reconcile, Steve, was if the matter had been investigated, there was found to be no case to answer, but flash forward, 4 years, it becomes apparent that the material is going to become public, and the action that's deemed to be necessary is to step down as a result of that.
Chris,
it doesn't gel.
Australia. Enter Cricket Australia, because after Tim Payne was appointed as Australian captain, to restore the integrity of the game, the complaint was then made to Cricket Australia, who decided that there was nothing to answer. Every new board member at Cricket Australia since that time was briefed on the issue. So it was well known internally and decided there was nothing to answer. And then, as you describe, word got out that the complaint was going to get a public airing. So all of a sudden, because of that piece of advice, it's conduct unbecoming of an Australian captain.
So, well, look, it either is or it isn't, whether it's public or not.
Absolutely. Now, where's the link to local government? One of them is if anyone's involved in a decision relating to review, a good question might be, how will we defend this matter publicly if it gets out? Now, that's not to say if someone's entitled to fairness, but an issue could be controversial, that they should, receive an unfair outcome. But it is worthwhile thinking ahead of what your stance is going to be, because I understand that both Cricket Tasmania and the playing group more generally is quite critical of Cricket Australia because of the fact that they've not stood by their own decision. They've, as an organisation, I suppose, shown once again a lack of character.
Steve, I don't mind saying over my career, I've had many times where someone's been in my office mulling over a particular issue. And I've often said, if this was on the front page of the newspaper tomorrow, would your thinking be any different? It's a really good test to apply. And clearly early in the piece, it wasn't applied in this case.
Oh, no, not at all. I thought one of the other really interesting takeaways this week, and I agree completely, Chris, was if anyone hasn't seen it, and I only caught 20 minutes or so, but the Samantha Mostyn interview at the National Press Club this week around women in leadership, around issues of family violence, around a whole lot of sort of social issues was an absolute cracker. And of course, Samantha Mostyn was asked about this question. And she relayed a conversation she'd had with Craig Foster, the former Socceroo, and they talked about women's sport, how women's sport has had to start with integrity and be absolutely conscious of the brand. And Craig Foster apparently made the comment, why would you pay membership? Why would you buy sponsorships from an organisation whose integrity is tarnished? And I think as local governments, we could, take the same view that, organisations these days need a social licence to operate. If they're going to have the trust of their communities, if people are willingly going to pay their rates and so they get value from them, then, how we manage our brand becomes really important at these times.
All right, let's move on from that. Mayoral elections, happy to say they're all done and dusted in Victoria for the 2021-22 term. Finally, the very last one was last night, and we'll come to that in a moment. A couple of things to note, Steve. I've done the analysis of the female-male mayors and deputy mayors story. What I haven't done is compared this to the last term, but we're at a point where we have 34 female mayors and, I beg your pardon, 35 female mayors and 44 male mayors. And I'm counting the two chair administrators in that. So we're at about a 55-45 split at the mayoral level. It's the other way around with deputy mayors. There are more female deputy mayors than male mayors, which is interesting as well.
I won't read anything particularly into that second one, Chris. We could draw a number of conclusions, but interesting that, that pretty much follows the mayoral stat pretty much follows the proportion of female representatives on councils, which is good. And I suppose the other part for me is, and it will be too early to have the stats, but again, there is, over the last week, there has appeared to be a lot of returning mayors.
There have been a few notable returning mayors. There's still a few new mayors in the mix as well, but Ruth Gaustrain at Corangamite, for example, I think is a 5th term. I see Dean Rees is back as mayor at Wangaratta. He's certainly had a number of mayoral terms to date. Lena Messina's been returned at Darebin this week as mayor. There's a change up in Tawong. I follow Tawong closely because I've done a bit of work with that group. Great group of people. Andrew Whitehead's the new mayor, but the last mayor, David Wortman, is in the deputy role. And a new mayor at Nillumbik in Francis Eyre, which was a good one to watch as well. Another interesting observation, Steve, particularly all the ones I've observed this week, most of them have conducted their meetings face-to-face in person, with the occasional councillor participating virtually for whatever reason.
Yeah, and that'll be good for those groups, starting the next year to at least be, change the mayor, change the group, good opportunity for a reset.
Borondara's been determined this week as well, and Jane Addis is the mayor there. And Stonington, of some of the bigger metros, Stonington's conducted theirs this week as well, and Jamie Clissaris is back in the mayoral robes at Stonington, and Ross Ebbels is back again as mayor at Queenscliff. Well done to Ross. And I want to finish on Yarra City. So Yarra had 4 attempts, would you believe, 4 meetings to attempt to elect the mayor. It needs to be said there are 2 councillors away on a leave of absence, so it's made the numbers a bit challenging. But as of last night, it's finally been determined, and Councillor Sophie Wade is the new mayor of Yarra. Councillor Edward Crossland is the new deputy mayor of Yarra.
Yeah, and I saw that there was some commentary made in the media or leaked out to the media, Chris, around that process. And I'd just say I think that council starts a little bit behind in terms of public trust, probably even their internal interactions, if they've had that difficulty making such a decision.
Yeah, look, it's probably worth watching for the tragics, watching that meeting back, particularly some of the statements that were made during the meeting were interesting, to say the least. But well done, though, to Yarra being the last to conclude, and we've got all of the results up on the Local Government News Roundup website now in one handy, ready reckoner for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, and actually I hadn't gone into the detail, but I did see a comment during the week, Chris, that because they were last, given the way that the Act works with the mayoral term and 12 months and so on, they'll probably be the last next year as well.
Yes, unless of course they have multiple attempts, and well, it'll be the last maybe, but it could drag on even into December. We'll see what happens 12 months from now. One would assume from some of the statements made yesterday that maybe next year's decision's already been determined, but we won't.
Can't imagine that happening, Chris.
We won't cast any aspersions there. What else have we got to talk about, Steve? You've got your governance advisory network happening today at the VLGA, I understand.
That'll be today, Chris. It's our officer-only session, and I would think we'll be spending a fair bit of time just sharing information around those compliance obligations coming up to 31st of December, and probably an opportunity for those officers that have come along to talk about maybe any gaps that they're concerned about, or sharing some things they're particularly pleased with.
I did want to also remind people that on the Local Government News Roundup website, I'm also keeping track of CEO movements in Victoria for this term of the council. There's 24 on the list now, with Mark Dixon's resignation at Wodonga last week. But more importantly, there's 8 councils currently that have not got a permanent CEO appointment in place. I understand Brimbank might be close. I understand Melton might be close, but I don't have any intelligence on the others. But if you're interested, so the 8 are Wodonga, Swan Hill, Yarra, of course, Melton, Bullock, Southern Grampians, Brimbank and Mildura.
That does seem like, it's effectively 10% of councils, Chris, and in some ways they're competing with each other. And we've talked before and will again about what a difficult climate is for recruitment at the moment.
Okay, before we wrap up, a couple of overseas notes that I thought might be worth mentioning just briefly to get your thoughts on, Steve. Firstly, to England, where one particular council has made a plea, is writing formally to the government, to Martin Gove, to get something happening in terms of legislation to allow councils in England to meet virtually. So clearly there's still pandemic issues in the UK. What I didn't realise until I read this, that in Wales, in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, councils are able to meet virtually or with a hybrid model. They're not allowed to do that in England, which seems a bit silly, doesn't it?
Leaving aside ancient Greece, Chris, the English would purport to be a bastion of democracy, and I just would have thought in these days they might have moved a bit quicker.
So keep an eye on that one. And I thought you might be interested to know that Sweden has a new, she's gone already. Sweden had a new female prime minister, first female prime minister, but she was only in office for about 7 hours this week.
We forget, Chris, that compare and contrast with the Westminster system, that post-war politics in Europe has been about wildly shifting coalitions, and that's a particularly wildly shifting one, which is an arrangement that we're not used to. And it will be interesting with the rise of independent candidates in Australia going forward, even past our lifetimes, as to whether that traditional model of a government and an opposition will be what we maintain. So, watch this space.
Yeah, interesting to compare the systems. The Prime Minister is elected by the Parliament in Sweden. Magdalena Andersson had the support of this coalition, put up a budget. A certain part of the coalition couldn't support the budget, withdrew their support, and she resigned.
We've been reminded of that Angela Merkel, over her extensive term as Chancellor in Germany, was able to maintain those coalitions for a long time, which I think just speaks to Merkel's greatness.
All right, I knew you'd have a thought on that, and that might be where we leave it. We've been all across Australia and even into Europe this week with our news. Thank you, Steve. I hope you have a great week, and I guess we're going to have to start thinking about summer series very soon.
Oh, we're doing summer series, Chris.
Well, I don't know. I said we should think about it, but it's an excuse not to wear the jacket and the collar, and you can get into your cricket attire, perhaps.
Yeah, well, let's have a think about that, because it will be summer next week. So
Exactly.
that'll of course be another issue of when does summer season start.
We'll have to talk to the boss.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, that's the governance update. It's proudly brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, and we're very, very grateful for their support for the program and their advice when it's needed. Steve, have a good week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Chris. You too.